In this exercise, we're going to be working with colors and opacity and creating them via CSS. You're probably already familiar with working with hex values when dealing with colors. We've done that a lot in the past. The hex values are created by using a combination of letters and numeric characters, usually 6. Sometimes you'll see shorthand notation like this where you'll only see 3 characters, but many times you'll see 6 characters together, and the collection of these characters go ahead and create a color, and you can create millions of colors using this method. What we're going to be doing in this exercise is I have a very simple page and I have 3 divs that say box 1, box 2, box 3. I'm going to begin by styling these divs so that they line up side by side, and then we're going to apply some different methods of placing color inside of these boxes and seeing how it interacts with the content inside of the box as well as the background of the page. So the first thing I'm going to do on my page here is I'm going to add some basic styling for the 3 divs. We'll just go ahead and begin by making a selector for div, and then I'm going to pass on some rules for these divs. We'll pass on width and height. We'll make a border that is black, 2 pixels, and solid. We're going to float these to the left so that they appear side by side, and we'll add some margins so that they have a little bit of spacing between each other. I'm going to use 0 for the top, 1.5 ems for the right, 1.5 ems for the bottom, and 0 for the left. And then I'm going to add a padding of 1 em all the way around. Got to make sure I spell float correctly. When I refresh in the browser, you're going to see that the 3 divs do appear as boxes and they appear side by side. But because I floated these items and I'm in no way clearing the floats, you can see that my footer is sliding up behind these 3 boxes. I don't want my page to look like this, so I need to insert a clear. A common way of inserting a clear would be to create an additional div somewhere inside of the HTML after the 3rd floated div and apply a clear to it. I'm going to share another method that uses a pseudo-class selector to accomplish clearing these divs. I'm going to apply my selector to the article tag, and I'm going to use article : after. What this states is that it's going to interject some content onto my screen after whatever the last item is inside of the article div. So this is going to appear right after this 3rd div. And we're just going to go ahead and insert some rules here. I'm going to add visibility of hidden. I don't actually want this to display, I just want it to be there so that I can use a clear on something, but I don't really want it to take up any content on my page. I'm going to tell the display to be block. I am going to set the content property, and then inside of quotes I'm just going to put an empty space. This is going to allow me to actually create something on the page that I can use as a hook to apply a clear on, but because I'm setting the visibility to hidden and I'll also pass on a height of 0, this isn't actually going to take up any space on the page. So when I save this, and if we go refresh in the browser, you'll now see that the page is responding the way that we want. And if I open up my developer tools, and here's our article tag right here, and you can see that I have the 3 divs and then I have this : after. That is the content that's being created with the CSS. This after content is getting all of the properties that we just specified in the rule. So this is a really handy little trick, and it eliminates the need for just putting in divs so that you have to put clears on them or something like that. So you might find this to be a useful technique. And once again, we're using our pseudo-class selectors to be able to accomplish that. Well, now that I have the page formatted in the way that I want, I'm going to apply some different colors to these 3 boxes so that we can see some different methods of applying color. We'll use NthChild to be able to target the divs here. So I'm going to use div NthChild, and then in parentheses I'll pass on 1 so that I can target the first div. And what we're going to do here is we're going to set the background color, and we're just going to use a traditional hex value. I'm going to use 069, which is a blue color. So if I hover over this in brackets, you can see the color it's going to apply to my div. If I save this and we look at it in the browser, you can now see that the first box takes on a blue color. For the next div, I'm going to use div, and again we'll use NthChild, but this time I'm going to pass on 2 because I want to select the second div. And what we are going to do here is we're going to set the background color, but instead of using the hex value, we're going to be using RGB. Now, if you've studied any sort of graphics application, you're already familiar with RGB. RGB stands for red, green, and blue. And what you do when you're applying RGB colors, you write RGB, then you open parentheses, and then in the parentheses you'll pass on the RGB values for that particular color. I know what the RGB values are for the same color blue. I've looked them up in my graphic editor, and if you have an application like Photoshop, you can go into your color picker, and I'm just going to find that color blue real quick. So here's the shade of blue that I'm using, 006699. I'm simply using the shorthand notation in my HTML page, and if I look right here, the RGB values are 0 for red, 102 for green, and 153 for blue. So if you have an application like Photoshop, you can look up what the RGB values are if you don't know what they are. There's plenty of other applications that allow you to find RGB values too. Needless to say, inside of the parentheses I'm going to pass on those values, and those values are going to be separated by commas, and then I'll close the parentheses and put my semicolon. If I save the page now and we look inside of the browser, you can see that this second box is getting the same color value that we just specified. The two of these, they're both now exact same color. In the third box, we're going to use another method of applying color. This is going to use the HSL method. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And this works very similarly to the RGB color. You're simply going to write HSL, and then in the parentheses you'll pass on the appropriate values to create that particular color. Now, finding the HSL values could be a little bit more challenging because HSL is not something that you can easily find inside of Photoshop. If you do use Photoshop or another image editing, you may have a dialog box that looks like this. You can see that I do have something called hue, and I have saturation, and then I have something called brightness. Hue, saturation, and brightness is close to hue, saturation, and lightness, but it's not exactly the same thing. There are several tools available that help you to be able to select the hue, saturation colors. I'm going to take a moment to show you a picture of the color wheel. So here is the color wheel right here. When you have the color wheel, you can see that there's units of degrees that go around the color wheel, and the different colors are assigned a degree unit that creates that color. So you can see that in between about 10 and probably somewhere around 360 I get reds, and then as I move towards lower numbers I get into more of the magenta and purples and blues and teals and greens and yellows and oranges. So all of these areas on the color wheel indicate some sort of color. Reds are always going to be in between the 0 to 360 type of range, and greens are always going to be in the kind of 120 area over here, and blues are around 240 if you wanted like a true blue, and then you can see the other colors reside somewhere else on the wheel. You can also see on this image of this color wheel right here, I have lightness values. So if my lightness value is set to 0%, that actually is going to be creating black. That's creating something that's completely dark. A lightness value of 100% is going to create something that's white. So 50% is kind of an average for lightness. Saturation, the S value, is going to either desaturate something or fully saturate something. So 0% for saturation is going to create something that is completely desaturated. 100% is going to create something that's fully saturated. So let's just say I wanted to create an orange color. If I look on my color wheel right here, I know that orange is created around 30 or maybe 25 degrees. So if I go back into my editor and if I write here 25, and then for the saturation and lightness, they always take on a percent value. Let's pass on 100% for saturation, which is going to create a very rich color. It's going to be fully saturated and displays full color. And then I'm going to pass on 50% for the lightness, which will give me an average lightness value. If I go ahead and close the parentheses and save my file, and we go back into the browser and we refresh, you can see that box 2 is now orange. Now that should have been box 3, but in my CSS I didn't change my NthChild, so let's change that one to 3. Since they were both 2, the second one overwrote the first one. But if we save now, the first 2 boxes are going to be blue, and then the third one is going to appear orange. So I can use the knowledge that I have on the color wheel to be able to achieve a particular color. If I wanted a green color that was fairly light, well, I could pick 120, and then I could increase the lightness value. So if we go back in here and we change this number to 120, and I increase my lightness value to 80, I should have a light shade of green. The advantage of using the HSL values is that once you understand them, it's really easy to tweak your color and make it a little lighter or a little darker or a little brighter or a little less saturated, because all you have to do is, if I wanted something that wasn't quite as intense or bright, I could just bring down the saturation. So if I reduce my saturation to 40%, I'm going to have a much more muted shade of green. And you can see it turns to more of like a sagey type of color. Well, sometimes you're going to have a predetermined color like we have here, this blue that we're using, and let's say I want to match this exact same color blue. Well, I could try to fish around in the color wheel and try to get something that is similar, but obviously it's going to be very difficult for me to probably find that exact same color. I may hit it eventually with some hit or miss, but that's not always the optimal solution. Luckily, there are some other techniques that we can use to be able to create these colors. Some of the tools that I like are the HSLPicker.com, and this allows you to actually dial in a color. If you know what the values are for the image, you can actually plug them in, and this is actually a HSL slider, so this I would have to know what the hue, what the saturation, and what the lightness is. But if I don't know, let's say I knew, for instance, what the RGB value is or what the hex value is, I could just type in the hex value and then it'll spit out and let me know what the appropriate HSL, and it's actually telling me HSLA, which is giving me alpha as well, but I only need these first 3 values, 200, 100, and 30, and that would give me the exact same color of blue that we're using. So if I go ahead and use these numbers, 200, 100%, and 30%, and I save my page and we go back and we look at it in the browser, you can now see that all of these 3 boxes are the exact same color blue. So this is a very useful website for you to be able to convert a hex value that you know, or even an RGB value that you know, into an HSLA value. Another useful tool that I like to use is a little color app. Unfortunately, it's only available for Macintosh computers, but if you go to mattpatinade.com, he has a bunch of free little apps, and one of them is called Colors, and the color app works like this. Once you've installed the app and opened it up, you can actually go ahead and use the little magnifying glass tool, and once you click this you can move it to any location you want on your computer screen, and when you click it's going to go ahead and copy that color. Now to get the actual HSL values you need to click the copy button right here, but if I was to now go into my editor and if I just hit paste, you can see that it's going to paste in the appropriate values for me. So this little colors applet is a really useful tool if you run a Mac. I don't know the equivalent of something like this for the PC. There may be one out there, but if you can't find one, you can just go to this hslpicker.com website, which is a good alternative. There are other tools out there as well, but these are just some easy ones that I thought I would mention to you. Let's get back into the opacity part of our color lesson. So far we've applied colors. Well, it's really easy to apply opacity as well. We're going to apply opacity in different ways to these three divs. The first div, we're just going to pass on the property of opacity. CSS has an opacity property. 1 would be totally opaque. 0 is going to be totally transparent. So if I wanted 50% opacity, I'm going to type in 0.5. That's going to give me 50% opacity. If I save this and we go look at it in the browser, you're going to see that this first box appears lighter than the rest. It's not only lighter, but it also has partial transparency. Now, because of how the page is set up right now, it is impossible to actually tell that this does have some sort of opacity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a patterned background behind my boxes so that we can actually see that the transparency is working. I'm going to go up to the rule that I already have for article, and here I've set my background color to white. Underneath that, I'm just going to set the background property, and I'll pass on an image that I already have. And I'll save the page, and if we go look in the browser now, you can see that the background, instead of being white, now has this pattern. And if we look through the first box, we can actually see through and see this pattern occurring. These other two boxes, because they don't have any sort of alpha or opacity assigned to them, are opaque and they obscure the background behind it. But the first box, because we used opacity, we can actually see through. Let's apply opacity to these other boxes. In order to apply opacity to RGB, we're going to use the RGBA value, and then inside the parentheses I'll put another comma, and just like what we did up here with opacity, we pass on 1 for completely opaque, 0 for completely transparent, and if I wanted 50% I would use 0.5. HSL works exactly the same way. We would just change this to HSLA, and again I would use a comma and then I would pass on the opacity value. If I save now and we refresh in the browser, you're going to see that the color of blue is the same. Now there is one key difference between these two boxes and the first box. You can see that the color of the text and the border appear to be gray in this first box. The color of the text and the borders are black in these other two boxes. The color of these things haven't changed, but when you use the opacity property, it not only affects the background color, but it's going to affect any other children of that particular parent item. So because the text is a child of this parent div, it is also affected to an opacity of 50%, as is the border. Anything that is applied to that div is going to take on that property. If we change the opacity value to 0 and we saved, you're going to see that this box is going to become completely invisible. So that clearly is a problem when you use opacity. The way to work around that is to use the RGBA or the HSLA values because they don't have that sort of problem. The only disadvantage to using these methods is support, and you'll want to check can I use. You can see that when we use the CSS3 colors, which are using the HSL and RGB, is very well supported in pretty much all of the modern browsers. If you do want to have support in older versions of IE, you are going to run into some trouble. But at this point, it's fairly safe to use this sort of method to apply colors. If you are in a situation where you want support for older browsers, the recommendation is to include fallback content, which basically means that I would want to declare a background color of an opaque color, like just the hex value, and then right after that rule I'll apply a rule that has some sort of opacity applied to it. A browser that does not understand the RGBA is going to ignore this rule and simply render the background color as being the opaque blue. That would work the same way with the HSLA. So this is one way that you can at least provide some sort of fallback content. Obviously the page isn't going to look exactly the same, but you'll get something that probably is going to give the user a similar sort of experience. So using the RGBA and HSLA are great methods that you can apply color to items, and you can also apply partial opacity techniques to the various elements on your web page. Being able to apply a multitude of colors and being able to use opacity opens up a whole new method of designing and layering items on your page.